Hello, everyone, and welcome to Loop and Learn's T1D speaker series, and a very, very interesting event today. This is Loop versus Omnipod 5 Revisited. We did this about a year ago to great success, and the panel members have agreed to return, and they know a lot more. They've lived with Omnipod 5 for a year now, and they have a lot to share. So we'll have Jon Fawcett, Matthew Kitchin, Tina Hammer, and Britni Schipper. And I think you're going to learn a lot, and welcome for coming back and joining us. As we normally do, here's our disclaimer that Loop app is a do-it-yourself closed-loop algorithm to help automate insulin delivery. It is experimental and not approved by the FDA. Patches or customizations are even more experimental. This presentation is presented to assist you in making your own decisions in consultation with your healthcare professionals regarding your own diabetes self-management. You take full responsibility for building and running the system, and you do so at your own risk. Oops. Okay. Some reminders. Just how this works today. Put your comments in chat, please, if you have questions or comments, or raise your hand, and you can see down in the little image here where to go find where to raise your hand. If you'd like to contribute something about your experience, please tap that and someone will ask you to unmute and give your question. Other times, please keep yourself muted so that we minimize the background sound, and the mute, or again, is the bottom left in your screen. So easily tap it. If not, we can do it for you, but we'd love it if you did it for yourself. And let's move on. Some reminders, please. Please remember that your diabetes may vary. Everybody's their own form of diabetes. Your diabetes may vary from the person in the next seat from you. So let's remember that. And management of type 1 diabetes is a marathon. It is not a sprint. You get there when you get there, and you stay as calm as you can, and you do as well as you can. So don't compete. We're all just doing the same thing. Again, please feel free to post your questions in the chat during the presentation, and when the panelists have completed their presentation, we hope there will be time to take additional questions. So let me introduce the panel. Jon Fawcett, design engineer. He's a developer of Loop Follow and Sugar Pixel. Matthew Kitchin is CTO in the healthcare industry. Tina Hammer is a science teacher, Loop and Learn moderator, and a homeschooler. And Britni Schipper has her BSN, RN. She's CD, CES, and mom of 5 little ones. And then we have the stats. You can read these for yourself, but real quickly, Matthew has an 18-year-old daughter. My goodness, she's grown up. She was diagnosed in 2014. She's been looping for 3.5 years, and on Omnipod 5 for almost 2 years now. Jon Fawcett's daughter is also 18, diagnosed in 2018, looping for 3.5 years, and Omnipod 5 for 1 year and 9 months. So she wins. She's been on it. No, she doesn't. Made a mistake. Tina Hammer's son is 14, diagnosed in 2019, looping for one month, 3 years and 1 month, and Omnipod 5, 6 months total. And then Brittany's little 7-year-old son, he's adorable, was diagnosed in 2018. He looped for 2.5 years and has been on Omnipod 5 for 2 years, 1 month. So I'm going to turn this over to the panel and enjoy the presentation. Ask your questions. We're ready for you.
All right. Jon, do you want to take it away? Well, I'll
Sure.
say,
go ahead.
We're going to split this into sections. I actually think I hit a slide accidentally that had the pictures Joanne was talking about. I apologize for that. And we're going to split this into three sections and then questions. The first of which is Omnipod 5 feature highlights. And then we have a little extra thing to add, and then we're going to do some myth busting. Jon?
So I say this phrase frequently, and this is what I think. It's listed as a feature highlight, but I think it's sort of the underlying biggest thing that we always see people post about. Why am I high? Why am I low? Et cetera, et cetera. There's no such thing as empirical settings. And what I mean by that is your settings on Loop won't work the same on Omnipod 5. What you're dosing on MDI won't work the same as they do on Loop or the same as they do on Omnipod 5. So anytime you're switching to a new system, it's really important to sort of start over. And I know with Loop, there's always been a lot of talk about test all of your settings, and here's a bunch of resources. There's a lot of Loop and Omnpod videos on how to test your settings. That's one area where I think Omnipod 5 has been lacking, is that there isn't really a good resource on, hey, here's what you need to do to start. And because of that, we see a lot of people that they're starting and they're super high. And it might be because the trainer started them like they would on a traditional pump of, let's go conservative with the basal settings as a safety factor. Well, after you start it, you can't change it. So one thing to keep in mind if you're considering going to Omnipod 5 is almost certainly your carb ratio will need to be strengthened. And I say that as my daughter having come from Loop. I'm sure Tina, Matthew, and Britni would probably say similar comments, that the carb ratio that works for Loop works differently for Omnipod 5, and it's just because the algorithm is different. So that's the first thing, is don't plan to just plug in your same settings and expect that it will work perfectly out of the box without some tweaks to that, especially tweaks to the carb ratio. Do you guys have anything to add to that?
Brittany,
Nothing.
Matthew?
No, I agree. I think absolutely, like, carb ratios for sure are typically always going to be stronger, or at least that was what we found. And I see that often. I work as a diabetes educator, so start kids on pumps all the time. And I'm blessed to be in a place where we are aggressive with settings and don't do the backing off of dosing from injections to pump. And I think that we see far better success with that transition than the standard of reducing basal like by 80% or to 80% of your baseline to start on pump for safety. It just doesn't work with an algorithm system like this. So
yeah, I could.
And
I could talk, about this for a while. I think I plan on covering some of it in the myths area, but unfortunately, from what we see in the user forums, it seems that endos and trainers frequently are not up to speed on how this works specifically with Omnipod 5. And they're, I don't know what pump technology they're using as their baseline. But, we all see it where people leave those sessions woefully misinformed, about how these settings do work.
And the one thing I was going to add was, from what I see, Omnipod 5 does such a drastically better job than anything Lilly used in the past at preventing lows, that if anything, you're better off starting slightly more aggressive, at least for us, is because unless you go crazy, like 150% stronger with all your settings, it's still for Lilly, it still handles the lows just fine and stops them before there's an issue. So we can move on to the next slide then. Okay, this is a big one, and this is so I just recently, there's actually two parts to this. I just recently confirmed some thinking I had on this with insulin, and so I'm gonna explain what I mean by this. But in the bottom line, for what this means, IOB is dynamic, is that it doesn't always mean what you think it means, and it's not as accurate as you think it is. So if you flip to the next slide, I'll explain sort of the math behind this and what this means. So the top graph where you see the 6 overlapping curves, this is just to try and show you sort of how basal works from a pump. Basal with a pump is nothing more than controlled insulin stacking. So the insulin lasts, assuming you're using Humalog or Novolog, 6 hours. And so each of these curves represents 1 hour. Now, obviously on the Omnipod, it's dosing that every 5 minutes, but showing you just 1 hour at a time for each of these is the simplest thing. So over the course of that 6 hours, you have basal stacking on top of basal on top of basal on top of basal. So that's how basal works with a pump with fast-acting insulin. And if you look at the red line, that's essentially the full duration of the first dose of the 6-hour duration of insulin time period to the last dose. And then the blue lines going off represent how much is remaining from each of those 6 hours. So the math is really simple for this. It's your basal rate times 2.1. That is the total insulin on board from basal from a pump. And it doesn't matter the pump. It's any pump using fast-acting insulin, 2.1 times your basal rate. So I've presented 2 examples here, and these are actually real examples of Lily's TDI from the beginning of May to the end of May. So at the beginning of May, her average TDI over a 3 to 4 pod range was 44. And at the end of May, it was 55. And you see that a lot of kids see that just from anything and everything from, vacation time to sickness to monthly cycles to changing from school to not school, all kinds of things. So with the Omnipod's math is you can essentially assume the basal that it's calculating is divide that TDI number by 48. And 48 comes from, it uses half of basal or half of TDI as basal, and then splits it equally over 24 hours. So 24 times 2 for the half. So that's the simple math of that. So with the first example on the left of 44 TDI, it's approximately a 0.91 basal rate. And I say approximately because they use proprietary weighting for the more recent pods that they won't share that information with. But that's a pretty close estimate. And with that 2.1 math that I just mentioned to you, it means there is 1.9 units on board, assuming basal's flat. Not obviously that changes if it adds or removes automatically, but 1.9 units of basal IOB. And I say basal IOB because pumps don't show you the basal IOB. They only show you over that amount. So this is specifically talking about total IOB. And then I threw in as an example a 5-unit bolus. So the first thing I want to point out on this, on why IOB really isn't what you think it is the red curve represents the insulin action for a 5-unit bolus stacked on top of the basal that's already in your system. And I've long been a proponent of on traditional pumps. Obviously, this is not loop-based, but traditional pumps setting for Humalog Novolog a 4-hour DIA. And that's because they, unlike loop, they use a straight line decay. Loop actually represents that actual curve that you see on the screen. The Omnipod 5, for what it shows you for IOB on the controller display, it's just straight time. And so 4 hours is the closest, in my opinion, that you can get for accuracy over the entire time period. But that leaves, as you can see, 10 to 15% from that black line at the 4-hour mark. Your controller will show 0 IOB. You still have about 10 to 15% of basal left, and that would be the red area that's to the right of that black line. So as the first point with this, with IOB being dynamic, not really being what you think it is that when it says 0 after a dose, you're still going to have some left after that. Now, if you were to set your DIA on your controller to 6 hours, it's actually just going to be the opposite. You're going to have the controller saying you have a lot more left in the 4 to 6 hour time period than what is actually left. Now, the second issue with IOB on the Omnipod 5 can be shown with the second example I have here from the end of May. Her TDI increased by 11 units per day. That now represents the pod calculating a 1.14 basal, which is 2.4 units of IOB at all times, total IOB in her system. And I don't know if you can see here, but just you can see like how much higher that blue line is on the second image versus the first image. That is insulin in your system when your pod shows 0. So right out of the gate, even ignoring doses, you have about 0.5 units on board all the time, extra from what you had 3 weeks earlier. So if you're running into lows, that's why. Or flip-flopped, if TDI went down and you're seeing a lot more highs, that's why. The boluses just exacerbate that, because now instead of having what's about like 0.75 units left of the red, you actually have the 0.75 units left of the red after hour 4, plus the extra 0.5 units of basal. So you've got a unit and a quarter extra IOB in the system when your pump controller says 0. And so that's comparing just the changes over time as it recalculates the adaptive basal. Most of the time, we don't ever have to worry about this. But the next slide, which we'll get to, it sort of explains how we deal with it personally.
I'll say, I did notice this myself when Reese was swimming. So when his TDI would change and he started going low when normally he wouldn't, because he could go into the pool with a certain amount of IOB, and we would continue doing that, TDI would go up and he would start going low. And so it didn't take me too long to figure out that was what was going on, that there was some extra insulin hidden there by that raise, which is pretty
and that's
cool.
the best way to explain it. It's hidden insulin that the system doesn't tell you about. But once you grasp the underlying concept, you can look at that TDI number and easily see that, oh, we're running high because TDI dropped. So there's less of that hidden insulin that the system doesn't show you, or vice versa. There's too much. And the
Ready for that?
yeah, so that's almost, but I see so many people just struggle with like, it's not giving me enough corrections, or I'm having to correct way too often, things like that if they're high. Well, I'd encourage anyone that's trying Omnipod 5, that if you do see a TDI drop, just do this simple math and say, oh, well, I have a half a unit less insulin on board at all times than the system is telling me. So when you do a correction, add more than you normally would, because that's essentially all the time. Every single hour, you have a half a unit less if this goes the other way, or a half a unit more.
All right.
I'm ready for the next one. Yeah.
All right. There you go.
So I was against resets at first, and then until we started doing resets. And
What's a
now,
reset?
so a reset is when you open the Omnipod controller or the app, and under I think it's under settings general, you literally pick a reset. It wipes away the history of the pump. You start it over from scratch with the brand new settings. So it clears out the adaptive basal that it's calculating and allows you to restart it over. So and I think a lot of people that have that have daughters or even adult females, this could be a helpful tool for just monthly need changes from the fluctuations of that, because there's times when you'll see a 25 or 50% shift throughout the month, and that's just what it is. So for us, the resets sort of became my version of loop patches, if I can say it like that. So I wrote the loop patches originally to force the algorithm to behave like I wanted it to behave in the best manner for our lifestyle, for Lily's lifestyle, for how she managed the system. Resets can do the same thing as long as you know what you're doing. So for the first part is you can always open Gluco, which the controller syncs to, and see your most recent settings. So you can always see carb ratio, correction factor, et cetera, all of your current settings. So if you are going to reset, keep that in mind. Or if you're forced to reset because your controller failed or your switch phones, keep that in mind. But we now do a reset about once a month. Lily will do a reset. And we start it at about a 25% stronger basal than the system will eventually take her to. So the Omnipod 5 system, just based on how she doses, when she doses, what she doses, will tend to settle on about 1 unit per hour basal rate from its own calculations. We do her restarts at 1.25, and that allows her to use the system in the best way for her lifestyle, which is she's an 18-year-old. She's working every day. She had college orientation this week where she's running around college campus. She doses when she can. She, sometimes is eating on the run or in the car or whatever. So it's not as a controlled environment as a lot of people. And the resets allow her to specifically use a stronger basal to cover some of the fats and proteins, and maybe not having enough of a pre-bolus time as you would normally if you're sitting down to eat dinner at home. Have you guys done any resets?
The only resets that I've done, one was a forced one. Thank you. Failed system at 1 o'clock in the morning. Thankfully I knew what to do. And that one, I just kind of used the TDI divided by 48 to be able to get it. The other reset that I've done that was helpful was post GI illness. So lovely GI illnesses cause us to use like almost no insulin. We suddenly don't have diabetes. And so then obviously when we start to have that full insulin need, basal is dramatically shifted to be way less. And then we have a bunch of roller coaster, excuse me. So we usually do a reset if we're in that situation to be able to help kind of get things back into place a little bit more quickly. Jon, one question I have for you that I'm curious if maybe this is part of the reason the resets is helpful. What is your typical like basal bolus split? Like, do you guys typically do like a 50-50, would you say, or?
Well, this will be the next slide. I don't know.
Okay. Because we're probably more like a 30-70 basal bolus. And I really feel like that could potentially be a factor of why the basal we don't have to do those resets, because the basal is pushed higher, quote unquote, from the adaptive state than, you know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, and as an 18-year-old,
Yes.
you know, I can't tell you the last time I looked at her controller other than like, hey, did that pod change connect to the
Mhm.
decks?
Mhm.
That's pretty much it. The graph, one of the graphs I think later, that was the first time I had pulled open any historical graphs in at least 8 months.
Yeah.
You know, so all I
Same.
can say is she's a young adult getting ready to start college, and she doesn't have to think about it all the time by doing some of these extra steps. So I don't know what her split is though, but if I had to guess is, and we'll talk about this later, is she's typically the resets help her not have to dose as much directly for protein and fat.
Mhm.
And well, that's a conversation for a little late for another slide.
Yeah.
Next.
What is next?
I'm
The frozen.
there we go.
There we go.
No, wait, that's not it.
Oh yeah, so this ties into what I just said. Is I haven't looked at a graph until yesterday or last night or this morning, whenever I sent that to you guys, historical data, because the system runs and her time in range and A1C is basically exactly what it was on Loop, but it's taking maybe 10% of the time, 10% of the both mental, sort of that mental brain space, and also 10% of actually doing stuff, whether it be going in and editing carbs, doing a correction dose, correcting lows, you know, adding a second dose. And so this was the biggest thing that sort of struck me, and I think is why she really, I don't see her changing back from Omnipod 5 anytime soon, is that we rarely have to think about diabetes in our house because the system handles it to enough of a degree that there's no major issues coming up, and a big part of that is the lows. So her lows are probably half or less what they were with Loop, to the point where it's once a month, maybe twice a month, where there'll be something more than just you know, she's feels like she's, you know, going down and she's 70 and just has a tab and that's the end of it. So it might be once a month or more where she's like, yeah, I need a juice or a Coke or something more substantial than just that.
That is impressive. Really impressive.
Yeah, the quality of life piece has definitely been huge for us as well. I feel like our son's able to stay in class longer. We don't have to pull him out to intervene to like edit the carb ratio or add more to be able to get Loop to like do what we wanted it to do. Like we knew it needed more insulin, but we couldn't figure out exactly why. We weren't always there to see it and to be able to adjust it. And it was just, it was a lot. And so with this, it's like, okay, we know that if he needs a little more because we missed on the bolus for breakfast, we miscounted or whatever, it's just like a quick, simple, easy, put the carb in and be done. Or just give whatever insulin amount we feel like is needed. But we usually don't have to do a lot of that. Usually the system is able to adjust and handle it. And so there's a lot more time in the classroom.
And that,
So,
go ahead, Matthew.
I love Night Scout, but I've never been so happy to not have Night Scout. It's an amazing thing, but you know, I used to stare at it. What happened? What did she do? What? No, how could she have done that? Because lunch was coming, and now I don't look at anything. You know, and we talk about, you know, we talk about diabetes related stuff, probably 5% of what we used to. And, you know, she just knows I'm high. You our joke is she's high because it's a day that ends in Y. I mean, it just happened. It did. She took some insulin, and we don't talk about it.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah.
my term in the last one is it's stupid smart. It doesn't try to do all of the. You don't have to do
You
the
don't
thing.
have to know the why necessarily.
Right.
Yeah.
And
You can
a
just
big
do it.
thing with that is you don't have to. You just you resolve it and you move on, and you don't
Mhm.
even have to think about it. So not only do you not have to know why, you don't have to think about it more than the 30 seconds when you're dealing with either a correction dose or a correction carb, because it's a fluke and it's going to handle it better or differently or whatever next time.
Mhm.
It's funny, not looking at Night Scout was hard for me, like not having it to look at, and then I got used to that, and it was when I would reset, that was hard because then you lose all your data, and that's another thing to get used to. But they're pretty easy to get used to, those losses.
And I see a
Refreshing.
lot of people asking, about a view app and stuff like that, which Gluru can do. I know we briefly chatted whether we wanted to mention this, but I feel like you don't necessarily need the remote viewing real time like we did with Loop. I just feel like it. I rarely even look to see what Lily's blood glucose value is.
Mhm.
The system's working, and I don't necessarily need any of that data. Now I get it if for younger kids, but at least for our standpoint is I'm like so thankful to not look at data anymore.
Pretty wild.
Yeah. We just use momentum of blood sugar and to know whether or not it's going to do its thing. Can kind of usually tell if we need to.
Let's answer Joanne's question really quick. Couldn't you do the same with Loop if you don't micromanage? So
I would say I couldn't with a kid because it wasn't intuitive to her, and the fake carbs and and so get with all the bells and whistles and tools and patches and trying to make it behave the way we wanted it to behave. For us, it was not conducive to at the time of, a 12, 13, 14-year-old girl.
yeah, completely. With an adult, and let me even reclarify that, not a young adult like Matthew and I's kids, but an adult that has a really consistent schedule, is on top of their diet and when they eat, what they eat. I think if you have a pretty straightforward schedule, Loop does require a lot less micromanaging. But for our situation, there's absolutely no way. Like Loop wouldn't have worked at all. It would have been worse than MDI if we hadn't gone through and micromanaged, tweaking the settings, running overrides, editing carbs, all of that type of stuff.
Mhm.
We have a little example coming up. I've actually tried making the settings in Loop so that they were, a little emulated Omnipod 5 a little bit more, and was pretty happy with it. Not ecstatic, but ecstatic for me back then. Like I'm growing into accepting. I've actually grown a lot into accepting less of a low and tight situation, and uh, back when we had just moved back to Loop from Omnipod 5, and I was trying that, it was going pretty well, I think, but then his needs changed, and then that's when it got wonky for me. Now, actually today I finally put a feature that we have that's called favorite foods on Reese's phone, which I have wanted to do for months, but haven't gotten around to. And I'm really excited about seeing how that will help, where we're not like putting, and you can use it in different ways, but I'm planning to use it in a way that is more, this is a larger meal that like he would usually eat for dinner, that sort of way, and try to be a little looser with it to help him be able to be looser with it and see how it will do.
So the carb stuff is an interesting comment. The eyelet does small, medium, large. That's how a Freza basically has people dose. That's how Lily doses. She's 15, 30, 45 carbs. That's it. Like, it doesn't matter if it's 38 versus 35. All of the research studies out there on carb counting show that as humans, we are 100% incapable of accurately counting carbs. And it's not all our fault. A lot of it is just, how you're measuring it. However we have to measure it isn't accurate enough. So for the most part, the majority of the time, every single person trying to count carbs is going to be off by 10 to 20% every single entry, every single one, which is why on Loop, so reliant on carbs, you're constantly editing because it is so fine-tuned on that carb count. So Lily doses typically 15 in increments thereof, and that's it. And if it was too much, the system 99% of the time catches the load early. If it was not enough, she goes in and just enters a unit, 2 units, whatever she thinks she needs, rather than relying on some precise correction factor. So that plays into sort of the quality of life thing of it also, is she just doses small, medium, large.
So what does she do if she has just like a little chocolate that's like 5 grams?
A lot of the time she doesn't dose for it.
Okay.
And the graph you have coming up very
up
well, that graph you have coming up might be an example of that.
Yeah. So.
But for the record, just so to throw it out there, her carb ratio on Omnipod 5 is 4.5. So one little tiny 5 gram thing of candy is a whole unit, just so you kind of see that comparison.
But also with that much more insulin, there's more ability for the system to give and take versus somebody who's on a much weaker doses. That's going to be a huge difference. Like 15 grams that's a big meal for a little body. Yeah. So,
and I think that's with any
system,
with any algorithm system.
Yes.
The greater your TDI, the more the system can adjust automatically for you because it has so much more range with Omnipod's 0.05 increments.
Yep, absolutely.
I've often found that when Reese eats high carb meals, they're easier to handle, which kind of seems like the same thing,
Yeah.
So ready for the next?
Yep.
See if I can do that. Did it. All right.
Is that me talking? Yeah. I think so. So basically, I just want to point out, like, I know that you talked a little bit about doing like a reset to be able to help not have to dose for the fat and the protein quite as much, but sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't for everybody. But the biggest thing is, I think a lot of people on these systems, maybe some of them are eating low carb, and so they're used to a big shift in their basal on like a traditional pump, to be able to kind of be that background or be that insulin. Essentially, they're using their basal and they're feeding it with their fat and protein meals, to be able to help prevent them from having to bolus. And that's where the system, like, you need to exchange that for bolus instead of basal because of how the algorithm works with that 50-50 split assumption for adaptive. So just important to like make sure that you're quantifying in some way and bolusing for fat and protein meals, especially on low carb diets. So just something to keep in mind.
And so Lily's never been on a low carb diet, but we always looked at it sort of at our general rule of thumb was the carbs are immediate. Right around hour 4 is protein, and right around hour 6 or later is fat. So just sort of looking for those rises. And before she was even on Loop, we were sugar surfing on MDI. And so we learned to just watch for those rises and hit them on the rise. And that's just, a lot of people don't realize that fat and protein turn into glucose in your system.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, probably one of our weakest areas is dealing with that. And I just try to remind her, hey, we had pizza tonight. We had cheeseburgers. Just take a look in 3 or 4 hours. That's the best we can do.
One of the reasons I struggle with the mentality of correction factor, like we honestly don't hardly ever use our correction factor at all. Like in my mind, if blood sugar is going up, what's the driving force bringing it up? Something's impacting it. Some food is being absorbed, fat and protein is being absorbed. And so we dose everything for highs for the most part as a carb entry, because to me, that's what's causing that high. Like we don't even hit the UCG or use sensor button is now what it is. But that's just our mentality of how it works. And we hit it, we see that rise, we hit it with a carb entry because I know that that's what's impacting it. And I have a little bit of grace with Omnipod 5. If I hit it a little too strong, it'll kind of catch it on the back.
The biggest thing we found though with that is if you wait too long to hit it, that's the most likely cause of a low.
Yes.
So with Omnipod 5, you want to hit it sooner rather than waiting. Because if you wait, it seems like no matter what we do, if we've waited too long, as soon as she doses a little bit, it's like crashing down. So, and that's really, it's the algorithm is going to bring it down eventually. So you don't want to wait too long and then double up what the algorithm's already done.
Yeah, if we wait and miss it and do it after, we would do less, like probably like half the amount that we would have done ahead, assuming that their algorithm has been doing some.
And one thing for people using it that I find helpful is take that. So I mentioned earlier, TDI divided by 48 is your approximate basal rate. Divide that by 12. And that's because there's 12 5-minute cycles in an hour. So you're taking your basal rate and you're saying, okay, here's the number that it is treating as basal every 5 minutes. Now, if you're a pretty low basal rate, you might see, because of the 0.05 limit, 0.05, then some zeros, then another 0.05. But anyone that's over, I think it's like 0.6 or something, would be 1.05 per minute. Anything over that amount that you calculate by dividing your basal by 12 is a correction bolus. So you can easily look at the auto entries and just say, well, is it dosing 0.3 every 5 minutes, or is it dosing closer to my basal, to use that as a little bit of a basis for if you're going to do a correction.
I remember when early on when I was using Omnipod 5, that kept getting me. And I remember, John, I was talking to you about that, and you're like, well, just give him 0.05. And I was like, 0.05 for a correction? And I tried it, and it worked. It didn't crash him, I was like, wow. So, very good point. All right, ready for the next?
I think so.
All right, we're going to do some myth busting. Probably not as exciting as the show Mythbusters, I hope, but
one of my favorite shows of all times. It was very sad when it went off the air. But yeah, we've kind of alluded to some of these, and I don't, diabetes in general seems to just be ripe with myths, unicorns, fairy tales, and people believing that big pharma is hiding these settings, or whatever it may be, and which is some of it's comical. I mean, why would they do that? Why would they, in an FDA approved product, the FDA approved product, have these hidden Easter eggs of wonderful tools? But that you can take a couple statements in Omnipod, in their user guide, very clear cut. Target glucose is the only adjustable setting that directly impacts automated insulin delivery. So they restate that at least 5 different ways throughout the manual. It continues, the smart bolus calculator settings are adjustable and impact suggested bolus doses in automated and manual modes. And then another very to the point line is, it is important to understand that changing your basal program, max basal, correction factor, or duration of insulin action settings will not impact smart adjust technology. So you're right here. Basal settings are relevant in automated mode. Definitely a myth. They're relevant in the fact that if you go into manual mode or anything like that, yes, it still uses your basal settings, but your programmed basal rate is used to start your first pod, and that's it for automated mode. After that, it starts using its adaptive basal rate with pod 2. So yeah.
But a helpful thing with that, it uses it if you do a reset.
Yes.
So that's the only other time it does it, because that's essentially started from scratch. So if you're considering a reset because you're constantly running high or constantly running low, look at your reset TDI divided by 48 and then push that either up or down, depending on which way you need to go, lower or higher, to do your reset. And that will reset it with a slightly tweaked basal rate. But that's the only time.
Absolutely. And one of the telltale signs you see in a forum is when somebody says, call your endo. I went to mine. They adjusted some settings and I'm doing great. There aren't some settings. Essentially, there's 2: your insulin to carb and your target, and almost everybody's at 110 for their target. So whenever you hear somebody say they've adjusted some settings, that's generally indicative that they might be misinformed. All right, you want to go to the next bullet point?
I'll say though, I found it exciting to start that second pod after any reset. It was, and see what it would do differently.
Right. So this people are passionate that they have hacked the system, and this is, and it makes sense. The term, unfortunately, the term sounds like it should make sense. But automated mode does not use your maximum basal setting. People think specifically that they've been forced into limited mode because they've hit their max basal setting, and believe that they switch to manual mode, raise the max basal setting, go back. I mean, when I say passionate, there are some people that, it's an understatement. So it doesn't. Again, if these things were the case, Omnipod would have to update their documentation. The FDA cares about these things. If you're misinforming your customers, so it is not a magical trick. That setting is not used in automated mode. It is strictly to prevent you from setting a crazy high basal in manual mode.
I would like to recoin it to the fat finger safety feature setting, not max basal, because it prevents you from fat fingering your basal to be an incorrect amount. And it also helps, obviously, if you're ever in manual mode and doing like a temp increase to prevent you from going over a set amount. That's the other time that it would be used. But
all right. So yeah, this, myth, opinion, however you want to term this one, it is a frequent statement that Omnipod 5 doesn't correct highs. And that's maybe it doesn't correct it quite as aggressively as some people might want it to, but it absolutely does correct highs. I'm going to defer to Jon to give the exact math on how aggressively it will correct a high, but it's trying to get you to your target. It will correct a high. And like I said, I'm going to defer to Jon now because I know he has the exact logic behind how strongly it will go after a high.
Yeah. So going back to my comment about divide your TDI by 48, that's approximately what the system calculates as your basal rate. Divide that by 12, that's basically what the system's going to give you for basal every 5 minutes. Obviously, there's some guardrails on what I'm going to say based on BG, trend, IOB, but the system is allowed to dose 4 times that in any given cycle. So if your basal, I think my example was, I actually forget what the example was from Lily, but if your 5 minute dose is working out to 0.1 for basal every 5 minutes, it's allowed to dose you 0.4 every 5 minutes. Now, obviously, there's a maximum and there's a cap of total IOB and other things that can limit that down the road, but that is how much it will dose you on a high. The graphs here, this is actually, I found this in the first time I had opened Night Scout reports when Tina asked me to. In the last 8 months, I found this from a few weeks ago where you can see Lily had dosed for a couple of carb entries and did the bolus with the dose. And then 2.5 hours later, she started rising again. She didn't dose for that. The system entirely brought that down. And the range here is 65 to 180 for the green. So it looks like she, in that second rise around 9:30, she hit probably 220 and it brought her right back down to, it looks like right around 100 because the dashed line in the middle of the green is 120. So it was dosing quite a few times, like 0.3, 0.4, as it was hitting that rise. And I think a lot of people believe this myth that it doesn't correct highs because they don't necessarily know that basal on a pump is nothing more than microboluses. It's just a microbolus every 5 minutes or whatever. So this is doing an additional microbolus when it's giving those amounts.
I remember people saying that it wouldn't, a lot of people would say it wouldn't bolus or dose more than like 0.1 at a time. And it's like, yes, it will.
Well, and that's because of their TDI.
Mm-hmm.
So divide your TDI by 48 and then further divide it by 12. That number times 4 is basically the maximum you should see on any given 5 minute dose. But they haven't told me how they handle rounding. So I'm assuming they round down to the nearest 0.05 rather than rounding up for anything. So just take that into account as you're doing the math.
Yeah. And so with this Night Scout graph of Lily's, you went in and you just put in the carbs and the insulin doses, right? And that's why it doesn't show anything else, right?
Yeah, so Omnipod 5 doesn't upload like all the automated 5 minute doses. And so you actually don't have that data that you have with Loop. Even in Gluco, you don't have that data. It just says whether the system was running, whether it'll tell you if it paused insulin or hit the maximum, things like that. But you don't see all the little ups and downs on the basal like you do with Loop, which I will say is quite liberating once you can let go of that.
Yeah, I agree.
Liberating for families, but I wish that I could see it sometimes to help patients.
Yeah. The one on the right happened the other night here where Reese, the fat and protein did not get entered, and he started climbing and people were sleeping, and I noticed it probably around midnight. I noticed what was going on. Now I will tell you, I am in a phase where I'm
So
intentionally not paying
Tina,
attention to.
are you meaning to show a plot here?
Sorry,
Are you meaning to show a plot here?
the loop graph on the right.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was confused.
Yeah.
I
So
apologize. So that's
no
Reese
problem.
on the right and Lily on the left. Got it.
Yes. So
Okay.
I am I'm in a phase where I'm not paying attention to his graphs or anything for the most part, because he's getting ready to go on a 2-week high adventure trip with his dad where they will have no contact with me. So they're in training. But every now and then I do see something, and the other night I saw this, and right around where the midnight where that line is, I woke up his dad and I said, "Hey, I think you want to take a look at this." I didn't go in and do anything to it myself. So he went back in there and added some carbs, and it's still, it took a long time for it to really start moving it down. Those were not added up front. And
I will also say, let me point this out because I think this is something people should know between these two graphs. Lily's on Loomjev. I don't know what
he's
Reese
on
is on,
Fies.
but okay. So yeah, they should be pretty similar then for that.
Yeah. Okay, ready for the next?
All right. So limited mode and manual mode. All the time I hear that the system is putting them in manual mode for whatever reason, because it's in that limited and they're stuck in that. So limited mode is different than manual mode. Limited mode, you can hit limited mode for two reasons. One is loss of CGM data. The other is if you hit that automated delivery restriction. So you hit that max insulin delivery or a max suspend for too long. And
Britni,
that's
sorry,
yeah.
will you please explain what limited mode is, just in case people don't know?
Yeah, so limited mode, well, that's kind of what I'm gonna eventually elaborate on, but essentially it's a version of the automated mode. So you're kind of put into this like limbo automated. Like it's not automated, but it's also not manual. So it's like this in between mode. And so you can go into it when you lose CGM data, or you can go into it when you hit that max insulin delivery. And what it does is it chooses a safe basal rate. So safe basal is one of two things. It's either the programmed basal rate. So this is where it is possible to have that basal program be a potential thing that could impact you. Again, you're not in automated per se, you're in limited, but it absolutely could impact what you're seeing if your basal rate is set far too low based on what the system is using. Because it either chooses, again, the program basal rate or the adaptive basal rate, what the system believes the basal is, whichever of those two is the less amount for safety. So it chooses safe basal in that limited mode. So that's where, again, like if your basal that you have programmed in the system, you put it on and then your kid's been on it for a while and things have changed, you're using way more insulin, maybe you were honeymooning when you first came onto it, or so many different possibilities. It's important to update that basal from time to time for a time when you would maybe go into limited mode, such as your Dexcom warm up is a huge time to think about that. We actually, some people will flip to manual mode during warm-ups. I personally don't like to do that. I hate manual mode in the sense that I don't know when those clicks are happening. I'm not able to tell that. It doesn't show that anywhere. I like to keep it in automated, which it would be in limited mode without CGM data. And then it'll show me on the auto events where those increments of dosing is happening, like how much it's getting. But when you go into limited mode for CGM loss, that actually it'll continue to dose based on the trend for up to an hour. So if you were actually dropping low heading into like a sensor loss or, a sensor change or something, it could potentially suspend that insulin and suspend your ability to get basal during that time for up to an hour before it kicks you into that safe basal. So I actually will, like, if I notice that and notice that we're suspended for a while, I'll actually bolus over that, is what I find to be better, just to be able to visually see how much insulin is actually going in. Or same thing, if you were rising heading into it, it could potentially be giving you way more insulin than you need. So something to be mindful of if you go into it for CGM loss, but just kind of explaining the difference in those modes.
In general, I'm glad you pointed out that with sensor change, because in general, Lily always leaves it in automated, but her readings coming out of a Dexcom change are typically way better than they were with Loop. And I attribute it to that hour that it's able to still either give her a little extra or withhold a little, that it keeps her in better range when the sensor kicks back on. So I see that as just a massive benefit to the system, and leaving it in automated to be able to kick it into this limited mode when it needs to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
I'll throw out there some of the wording in the message for why they got limited mode, I think contributes to why people believe the max basal setting matters.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
It's just, they use some wording that is conducive to confusion.
Mm-hmm. Again, why I think that setting should be called something different. Absolutely. It is confusing. All right. I think that's, so then this is the other piece. A lot of people think, well, it keeps kicking me into manual mode. It keeps kicking me into this. Well, that's actually not true. The system will never kick you into manual mode. You physically, as the user, must switch you over to manual mode. Yes, it'll kick you into limited mode when you hit that automated delivery restriction, but it's never going to kick you into manual mode. You get an alert. It'll keep you in that limited state until you clear that alarm that's on the controller. And through clearing that alarm, it forces you to switch to manual mode. And then you just have to stay in manual mode for 5 minutes and then can switch back. This is a safety feature of the system. And what I find, I personally have never actually hit the automated delivery restriction for max delivery because we're usually bolusing. I have seen it for low suspension, usually like following like a GI illness or something, but never seen it personally for the max delivery. But if you're getting this all the time, this is a very clear sign that you might see it maybe in the beginning when you first start on system, but if you're getting this often, that's a clear sign you need your doses changed. You need higher carb ratios. You need to bolus for fat and protein. You need to bolus in general more often than, it's one thing for, Lily maybe misses every once in a while, but to literally not bolus at all, like that's where you're going to start to see this happen more often.
It won't let me correct.
I see this one all the time, is people are running high and they say it won't let me correct. And it's because they open the bolus calculator, and they just tap the CGM button and it doesn't suggest anything. You can, just like with any system, you can go in at any time and type in a number. And Britni mentioned earlier that they don't really rely on the correction factor. Lily doesn't either, because I've always had a sort of I've never liked that term. I've never liked how it was presented, because if we rule out, obviously there's stress and illness and activity and things like that, but basically glucose is pushing blood sugar up, insulin is pushing blood sugar down. That's it. And so you're dosing for glucose, treat it as food. Pretty much you're usually going to be correct, unless there's some extraneous factor like an illness happening or something like that. So I actually don't know if Lily's ever gone in and used CGM to get the system correction. She just goes in and doses a unit or 2 units or 1.5 or whatever she knows she needs. And I sort of liken it back to, I think it was Katie's blog that talked about dosing for an egg, like eat something you know how to dose for. And it's like, oh, I take 1 unit for an egg or something like that. That's sort of how we treat it is, yeah, I know this meal, this small, medium, or large size meal with, a certain amount of fat or chicken or protein or whatever, pizza, is going to take an extra 2 units or 3 units or whatever. So she just literally types the correction in.
All right, are you ready?
Did anybody guess? I saw Carol put in to have if anybody could guess it.
Anything? Anybody? All right.
I'm just jumping in to give you guys a time check. It's been 70 minutes. Are you close to finishing your slides, or how would you like to wrap this
This
up?
is the last slide.
Perfect.
And I yelled out the answer, but I was muted. So do I get credit?
So sad. Do it again, Marion.
It will learn you.
You win.
Absolutely does not learn. The only thing it learns is your total daily, period. End of story. It's the same response at 1 in the morning as it is at 1 in the afternoon. Everything is the exact same. So don't think, oh, I can't correct because it's not going to learn me. No, if you need insulin, you give insulin.
It seems this one is definitely, there's trainers and endocrinologists out there that appear to perpetuate this one.
Yes.
And we had somebody in the Facebook group who was over a year in and just at their wits' end because they never corrected, because they were told if they corrected, it would think it was a carb and not I don't know. I divided by 0 in my head when I heard what they said. But
it was an override. If you corrected, it was going to be an override.
yeah, that's what it was. All corrections, and they were so confident. I was like, "Good. What am I missing here?"
No, that setting exists for a reason.
Right.
And really, it shouldn't take any time at all to have the system running smoothly for you. If it's not running smoothly right out of the gate, from day one, you started with bad settings, like way too strong or way too low of basal. Just do a reset and tweak it for the next one. If it starts perfect and then 2 to 3, 4 pods in, you're running really high, your carb ratio needs fixed. That's usually the only 2 things that take any time at all. And once you have those, there's no need to sort of even, I hate the word learn, I say it remembers your TDI. There's no need for you to even build up that memory of TDI because you can do a reset with knowing exactly where it needs to be.
Right. That's such a consistent myth. Oh, it takes a month or 2 or 3 to really learn you. And it's, and then they blame Omnipod. They're like, the vaunted algorithm is not what Omnipod claimed. I'm like, they never claimed it. It's such a powerful myth that people think it's claimed by Insulet, which it never was.
I'll answer Mike's question that I just saw pop up. When Lily switched from Loop to Omnipod, I was running all 3 or 4 of the patches that I wrote. So she intentionally was running a stronger basal than real life because I had the basal lock and all of that stuff going. I took her TDI, divided it by 48, and I think I actually bumped it up 5 or maybe even 10% because by the time she started, I already knew it was great at handling caloric. So that's the first thing with the setting there, Mike. And then the second is her carb ratio strengthened by 25%, maybe even 30% stronger on a Omnipod 5.
Yep. Oh, we did the same.
Similar to me. I can't remember exactly what we did with the basal, but it was definitely the basal we started with was too weak, and the carb ratio was I've probably gone up 30 or 40% total, to this point, and I haven't touched that, or she hasn't touched that carb ratio in probably 6-8 months at least. We haven't done anything really, except
we don't change ours much.
Same. Let me ask.
Let's say it probably changed the DIA when she switched to Fiasp, but that's it.
Let me ask you guys a question. Do you have only a single carb ratio on Omnipod 5?
Yes.
Like breakfast, lunch, dinner, etc.
Yes.
You just use one?
Yeah,
Britni, you're muted.
You're muted.
Britni, you're muted.
Sorry. We have a stronger for breakfast, but all the others are the same.
Okay.
When my
Lily has
daughter
had a
was-
single.
when my daughter was younger, we had to really hammer it at breakfast. And sometimes I attributed it to that she had suspended a fair amount throughout the night. And so her IOB was low. But I think on Omnipod 5, even, when she was probably 10 or 12, we would have had to go stronger at breakfast. We almost had to double it when she was little.
There are two questions in the chat. One is, are there any other Loop systems beside Loop that will let parents remote bolus for kids, particularly at school or while away from the parents?
No, there is none.
I don't think you'll ever see, or at least not anytime soon, an FDA approved system that'll allow remote bolusing. It's while we get it and we understand it and we know, some of us know how to put the safeguards on it. It's what freaks people out.
I'll tell you, as a very competent person in doing the system, I have put in 2 for grams to put into Loop before, and bolus actually 2 units, and had to rush to school with a snack. So I as a competent person having made that mistake, I can only imagine what others would do. So I would never foresee seeing that with a FDA approved system.
I don't think so. Not in
my life.
Yeah.
Nope.
Okay, and then one more question. You can handle this any way you want. Can you recommend a diabetes educator to handhold my 19-year-old when she switches from Loop to Omnipod 5? Britni, do you offer this service? I think it's better if she works with someone besides me, her mom.
I personally do not offer this service. I do work at like a physician's office, so I don't do services outside of that per se. I definitely help with tech troubleshooting and things like that in the online community, absolutely, as much as I can, but setting stuff not necessarily. Integrated, I think, would be a potential good option if you're looking at getting somebody like on the side. That might be an option for some like one-on-one attention for the transition.
Catherine Gentile at IDS does a great job, and she works with kids and teens. So yeah, they have some good staff.
Yeah,
but you have to shop and see what you feel most comfortable with.
absolutely.
We go to the next slide, and then I'll stop sharing, and we can keep going questions. Joanne?
All righty, here we go. Thank you everyone for showing up tonight. One more quick answer. AAPS, IAPS, and Trio also do remote bolusing, but they are open source, not commercial systems.
Yes.
If you want to give back to the community, you can always jump in and offer any support. Editing is always welcome. And you can also support the Night Scout Foundation that supports Loop and Learn for some of the work they do, and they work with developers, a wonderful foundation and 501(c)(3), so that is an option as well. If you have further questions, I'll be hopefully posting the video in the next day or two, and you can post them in there or send messages to anybody on the panel, and I'm sure they'll answer. Thank you again, everybody. Thanks, panel. You did a fabulous job. Thanks for being so encouraging. You all have a nice evening, and thank you for
Marion.
being here.
Thanks, Joanne.
Thank you.
Thank-
Thank you, everybody.